While he needs little introduction to anyone who has an interest in social justice in Australia, I thought I should mention on this occasion that Julian Disney graduated from the University of Adelaide and was a South Australian Rhodes Scholar. He's a former president of the Australian Council of Social Services and, of course, a former Dunstan Fellow. His commitment to insisting on greater equity in the Australian community is rarely equalled. I'd like to welcome Professor Disney.
Thanks very much indeed, Catherine. I'll also apologise to those of you on that side, because having sat there recently, I know you will be able to see me. I just want to say at the beginning, this is my hometown, as Catherine mentioned, although I haven't lived here for a long time. But there are two, I think, extraordinary Australians who've died since I was here last, and whose I just want to particularly pay my respects to. One is Graham Hugo, who many of you will know, is at the University of Adelaide, and the other is Hugh Stratton. Their work was relevant to the things we're looking at today, and they were really quite outstanding by national and international standards as academics who engaged with the world and contributed a lot of their time pro bono. They wouldn't have even thought of it as pro bono, they would have thought of it as just natural, and they were very inventive, very committed, but they were also rigorous. So I just want to mention those two in particular. I also just want to say what an extremely good video I think that was. Often over the years I've been asked by people in the media or even people who are organising conferences to tell them people they can talk to or put on television or whatever who are experiencing the hardship themselves. And I've always been very wary about that, because having worked at the front line quite a lot myself, I know that very often if people do agree to do that, they've got themselves into more than they bargained for. And I've always felt that that kind of video was the best way of doing it, because many people, as you saw there, who are in these circumstances can be very effective advocates in a way for their cause, much more effective than someone like myself. But you need to put them in an environment where they will feel reasonably comfortable, and that seems to me to have been done extremely well. I think also the effectiveness of it, frankly, is to some extent contributed to by having organisations of the kind like Hutt Street. I think it's a combination of the skills of the video maker, frankly, and also of having the right kind of agency that can assist in the making of it. So I just want to congratulate them and encourage the wider use of the video. The last thing I'd say about it is that I think it gets across very effectively possibly the most important thing that needs to be got across to the broader community about homelessness, and that is, if I can put it, I find most profound thoughts can be put usually in, there's already a common saying that's got the nub of it, even though they may then be encrusted with all sorts of academic theories. And in this case, I think it's pretty simply, but for the grace of God. Many people who went into homelessness, what put them in that circumstance was what could happen to a very wide range of people. A lot of it's just plain bad luck. And incidentally, there's a book I'm looking forward to seeing, which is coming out from Andrew Lee, the Federal Member of Parliament in Canberra, focusing on luck. And I think it's very important to bear that in mind when looking at attitudes towards homelessness. I've been asked to sort of speak from a very broad perspective, and so I'm going to do that. The title, National Prosperity and Social Justice, is about as broad as you can get. I'll probably try and weave the Crows or Port Adelaide into it at some point, but that may or may not happen. Certainly if I were in Melbourne, I always pathetically weave AFL into it somehow in order to capture their attention. But I'm going to start by looking at some comments about what seemed to me to be core values, which was particularly what the organisers suggested I talk about, but then about some core strategies. I tend, I'm afraid, to be in some ways more interested in the strategy for achieving the values. Not that I don't think the values are important, of course I think they're absolutely fundamental. But I think, in the words of a real leader in the welfare area, David Scott from the Brotherhood in Melbourne, he said, "Don't mourn for me, organise." That was the title of his book. And the titles, I think his family, I know, agree with me, the title's better than the book itself, but it is a great title. So firstly about values. I think really as an overarching value in this area, the good old Aussie expression, a fair go, really still stands up as well as any expression for a core value. It can be called social justice, it can be called lots of things, but I just like the simplicity of a fair go. I think there are three particular aspects of fairness that I want to mention. The first is opportunity, the second is protection, and the third is respect. And I'll come to each of those in a moment. They apply, incidentally, not just to people, but also to institutions, including businesses, for-profit organisations and others. These are principles that I think apply not just to the human entity, as it were, but I also think it's very important for us to bear them in mind for future generations as well as the present. And having previously led a sort of national advocacy group, I've always felt that when you're in that situation, you should be not only trying to think about the interests of the people who are currently the members of your organisation or the kinds of people who your organisation are trying to help, but you should think about who will be in that sort of situation in 20 to 30 years' time. I think some lobby groups don't do that. I think some business organisations, some unions and others focus too much on the interests of the current people in their industry or union and not enough on the people who will be either in the union or the kind of people who are in the union in 20 or 30 years' time. And I don't think one's responsibility is just to one's current constituency in that situation. It's also to the people of the future. So fair opportunity, firstly. I think it's very important that we recognise that the opportunity should be for a diversity of outcomes, not just the outcomes that the elite may regard as important or that have been important to the relatively privileged in the community as something that's brought them success and happiness in life. We need to avoid, I think, the danger of assuming that the way forward for other people will be the same as it was for us. And I do think that's a problem that's bedevilled quite a lot of policy thinking, including perhaps on the side of those people who would see themselves as progressive, who've tended to think that what was important for their advancement is what will help other people. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but it's encapsulated a little bit in what I have often said to my children, which is that there are different kinds of intelligence. And I think we've tended to put too much emphasis in the last 20 or 30 years on the kind of intelligence that gets recognised by universities or whatever, and not on the kinds of intelligence that you'll find in trades, that you'll find on the sporting field. This particularly struck me when a house was being built next to us in Sydney. The people building it were, in one sense, pretty rough and ready. Their language was certainly pretty lively. But it really brought home to me the skills, for example, of bricklaying, the intelligent skills, not just the manual skills, but the intelligent skills involved in bricklaying. And I think we've tended to downgrade those things. As people have had increasingly an opportunity to go to universities, etc., and many of our leaders, and I guess I'm not wanting to single out the Labor Party, but since they aim to be very progressive, some of them, for them, the way forward has been education. But they came from basically functional families with an interest in matters of the mind, not in the overall broad scheme of things hugely disadvantaged. For them, the main thing missing was education, which in turn meant some money to be able to do it. That was very important for that generation. It's still important, but I think it's been assumed that that is the way forward and the best step for many people for whom it's not. And it's led to a deterioration in respect for other forms of skills and intelligence. And in a way, we're almost at the worst point now that we've been for 30 or 40 years. Both sides have been in this. This isn't a partisan thing. Both sides, I think, have been tending to move too much in that direction. So the opportunity needs to be for a wide range of options, not too much driven towards what we think are opportunities that matter. It needs to be, and Tim dealt with this earlier, it needs to be, I think you said, formal and informal. I call it sort of theoretical and practical. It needs to be real opportunity, not theoretical or paper or legal opportunity. It needs to be an opportunity that is practically available for people. And That's a thing that I think is often overlooked. And I have to say my own, to the extent I'm trained in anything, I'm trained in law, and I think it's an error that a lot of lawyers make quite often, is to think that provide someone with the legal right and you've done your dash, that's enough. They'll be able to go off and use it. And that's not at all the case. We need to focus much more on the practical opportunities. I think also we need to make sure that we're not seeking full equality. I'm actually not that keen on equality as the overarching goal of a lot of this. I think that equity, fairness, is important. Equality can easily be thought to mean complete equality. Complete equality is gained at a very, very high price. I think we need to avoid gross inequality, and we need, funnily enough, to avoid, I think, inequality between the bottom and the middle, if I can put it that way. Often people focus, and I admit sometimes it riles me when I see people getting levels of wealth way beyond the contribution they've made, but that's not the main problem for people in the bottom 10%. The gap that really matters to them, I think, is the gap between them and the mainstream of the community. It's the mainstream that largely they want to be in. To be frank, whether we like it or not, quite often they'll enjoy the antics of the top 1%. They don't aspire to be there. But what really hurts them in their daily lives very often will be the gap between them and the mainstream. So I think that's the gap we need to focus on, even though the other gap may annoy us, and it's got a lot worse in recent times and have other problems about it. But full equality, I think, firstly, how do you measure it? So for some people, money is very important, for others it isn't. So if you make sure everyone's got an equal opportunity to have money, that may not mean you've provided them with an equal opportunity in terms of what really matters to them in their life, and vice versa with, say, creative activities. So we shouldn't be too perfectionist here, but we should just try to strengthen people's opportunities, and particularly those who are the most disadvantaged, and strengthen them in a practical way. But that leads then to the second point, which is protection. And one of the things there is that protection is very important for opportunity, because I think one of the ways in which many sort of children of the middle class, as it were, get an advantage on others is that they have the protection of the family and its resources to fall back on if things go wrong. And I think that security is often underestimated by many, many people across the social and economic spectrum as to how important that fallback security is, even if they never call on it. The fact that it was there has enabled them, amongst other things, to take risks and to take advantage of opportunities. So protection is really closely linked with opportunity, but it's important in its own right anyway. And another worry I have over discussion, again across the political spectrum in many ways in the last 20 or 30 years, is to some extent thinking that opportunity is enough, and again thinking that there are people who, if they're just given the opportunity, will then be able to sort of totally look after themselves basically for the rest of their life. And we've got to be realistic that isn't the case. There will always be people, the most obvious examples often are to do with disabilities or severe mental health problems, but there will be others as well for whom, even if we try to provide them with as many opportunities as possible, they will remain in need of very substantial protection. When I say protection, though, it's not a word that I'm entirely happy with as to the best word for getting across what I want, because I don't mean by that just a cocoon, unless a cocoon is really the only option. I don't mean just putting in a corner and looking after and giving up on or almost forgetting about once one's provided them with basic security. It's one reason why, incidentally, I've never liked the term safety net as a description of what we need. We do certainly need to help the most disadvantaged people, to provide them with protection, as I've said, in difficult circumstances. But to me, a safety net is actually too much of a sort of inert image. We need to perhaps provide a safety net to take the force off the fall, if I can put it that way, but we don't want to just leave people sitting in a safety net. We want to provide them with some way of going forward. And incidentally, while talking about imagery there used to be an image, I recall the former Deputy Prime Minister Brian Howe, I'm a great admirer of, but he would often talk about needing a springboard for people to go into the workforce, for example. I actually don't think that's quite the right image. For many of the most disadvantaged people, it's not one day you're out of it and the next day you're in it. I think actually going out through the surf is probably a better example, where you get knocked down, or I do anyway, You get knocked down, you stand up again, you go forward perhaps 3 metres, knocked down, back 2, and then eventually maybe you get out the back to calmer waters. And I think that's a better way of thinking of what it's like for many of the most disadvantaged, and to be realistic that that's what's going to be needed. So protection, I think, is crucially important. We must make sure that we don't get carried away with opportunity as able to solve the problem for everyone, but also we should try to make sure that we don't just too readily ourselves and in relation to the person we're trying to help get into a mode where we think protection's all we can do. We need to be realistic that sometimes that'll be the case, either permanently or for a significant period, but always alert to trying to see if there's an opportunity to take things forward. And that's one reason, incidentally, why the targeting of government and other resources has to be done very carefully, because if you do it too much, it's actually quite counterproductive. We really need to encourage people to take risks, and I can perhaps give you a little example there of something that we lobbied for hard quite a while ago, and it was adopted by the Labor government. Then the Liberals and the Howard government abolished it, but then they reintroduced it. Actually, Tony Abbott was the minister at the time, reintroduced it under a different name, of course. The politicians always do that. But basically what it was doing was, in a sense, averaging the income of unemployed people, so that if they tried to make a go of it in the workforce and had a few good weeks, if I can put it that way, made some money, they didn't get knocked off the benefit straight away, because they might have 2 or 3 bad weeks, or even a lot longer than that. And we needed to take a longer term view. The old approach, the sort of sudden death approach, worked all right when, if you go back to the mid-70s, you'll find that in the Royal Commission on Poverty, the Henderson Commission, long-term unemployment was defined as 6 weeks. That was long-term unemployment. Nowadays it's often 2 years is the measure that a lot of people use, and that shows you how times have changed and how you need to take a more patient, in a way, longer-term approach towards people's ability to return to the workforce. And protection, of course, has become in some ways more important in recent times, because much of the thrust of economic policy over the last 30 years or so in Australia, and in the sort of Anglophone world in particular, has been to transfer back to the individual quite a lot of the risks of life. Now, that's been allied with an attempt to also make sure that the older system wasn't too sclerotic in a way, and there may have been a need to adjust, but I think in many areas we've gone too far, and the risk has been transferred too much to the individuals. You see that in employment, where I think personally not much doubt that there was a little bit too much cushioning of workers for life, perhaps going back a few decades ago, but we've gone pretty much to the other end of the spectrum now with highly precarious employment, especially for the younger generation. And I think we're going to pay high costs for that in the future, both fiscal costs and of other kinds. I guess it's in the nature of society to swing, to overcorrect, and I think we have in various areas overcorrected. In the 70s, broadly, for example, we thought that the public, well, I won't say we, but many people thought that the public sector could do everything. We then swung perhaps excessively to the other point of view, that the private sector could do everything. I hope we're going to be able to find ourselves more in the middle, realise actually that there are 3 sectors anyway, the commercial, the non-profit and the government, but not to think that either of them has the magic answer to everything. So that's some comments about protection. And I just want to, in a way, return to a point I made earlier about the new face of poverty, which I think quite a few politicians of relatively advanced years don't quite understand. That now, as many of you know, it's not a lack of money or perhaps the socio-economic status in itself that one comes from. It's so often those who are most disadvantaged, whether they're homeless or long-term unemployed or sole parents, very often amongst those who are disadvantaged. Mental health, coming from a deeply dysfunctional family with violence or drugs or abuse. Those are so often the causes nowadays, utterly different from in the past where people focused so much on the need to have money and educational opportunity, etc. The face of poverty now is very, very different from what it was, the predominant face, very different from what it was some decades ago. Moving to respect then, I think respect is important. It's somewhat intangible, but it's almost in a sense the oil that makes some of these systems work. If we're going to try and grapple with and balance powerful forces towards economic development and social development, which I want to come back to in a moment, there will be sort of grinding at the boundaries. And this applies not just to economic and social, but to cultural and religious matters and all sorts of things. If we want to provide freedom, we also will need to recognise there'll be grinding at the boundaries in doing that. And respect is a very important part, I think, of trying to enable freedoms to thrive to the maximum extent possible. Freedoms always have to be balanced against other freedoms. I don't think there's any absolute freedom. But we can improve them if we have that sort of oil, which is important probably for all the freedoms of respect. I think in that context that, without wanting to be too controversial, I have a feeling that a word like diversity actually captures what used to be called multiculturalism more effectively. I do think we need to be careful that we don't confuse monoculturalism in a number of different places with multiculturalism. I think we do want a diverse community, not a number of, to use the terrible jargon, silos, as it were, in a cultural sense. We want people to have a strong sense of what they may think of as their own culture, but also a degree of awareness of the broader knowledge and attitudes and values that can bind us together to a reasonable extent as a nation. I'm not over the moon about massive national identities, etc. But again, it's perhaps a question of oil or glue. And I just have a feeling that diversity may really more accurately capture what we should be on about there. In relation to respect, I think also it's very important in our language, aggravated perhaps by social media, that I'm very concerned about how often people with whom one disagrees are described as idiots, morons, insane. I mean, firstly, it's inaccurate. just to start from the point that people who are often called that, whether one may think they're totally misguided and that they're unpleasant people, but they aren't morons. Many of them aren't idiots. They aren't insane. And it's not just that it is unnecessarily increasing the heat and decreasing the effectiveness of public discussion, but it's also that it diminishes the chance of the person saying that understanding what the difference of opinion is due to. If you just say it's due to insanity, it means you're not really thinking very carefully about what the difference is. The other person may have got it completely wrong. They may be unpleasant. They may never be persuaded to change their view, but that's very different from being insane or a moron. And I think those things do matter. I must say too, I am greatly concerned and have been for a long time about the treatment of public figures in Australia. I do think that if we're not careful, you get the public figures that you deserve, and that we do need to respect more of the public figures. I think you see it on the sporting field. I'm not thinking particularly of the recent example, but as my family well know, because I complain about it a lot, I don't like the way in which increasingly sports people are treated as gladiators, sort of paid gladiators. It's reflected now. Everyone talks about the AFL as an industry, not a sport. Those people are human. The best part of watching sport often now, from my point of view, is watching the camaraderie at the end of the game between the players. They're not carried away with the nonsensical, over-the-top antagonism between teams that some of the supporters do. And the same is true, incidentally, in politics, that you will find behind the scenes, away from the camera, lest it does damage, quite good relations sometimes between politicians. But in my experience, which is more some years ago now than more recently, but I must say I found, especially amongst the senior politicians, a degree of commitment to the public interest. Sure, it might be combined with an overweening ego or whatever. I was around when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister, and when Keating was Treasurer. I'll throw in a few others. But sure, they may have those characteristics, but there's a hell of a commitment to public interest amongst a lot of them as well, and I think we often don't treat them appropriately, not just in their own interests, but in our interests in order to attract people of calibre to go into public life. So I think respect's important there. And finally, I'm often disconcerted by the extent to which people's views will be dismissed because, if I can give an example, they're a fish shop owner or they're a bogan or whatever. To me, that's irrelevant, and again, it's another example of confusing, getting away on an issue that isn't relevant. It doesn't matter whether they run a fish shop or not. It matters as to what their experience and the strength of their arguments is. And I find in some circles where, frankly, quite often I agree with the conclusion that people have, but I don't agree with the way in which they're expressing it at all, and with the lack of respect that they have for people outside the charmed circles of the inner cities. That's, I think, I think that problem has probably got worse in the last 20-odd years. So those are some things about values. I'll now just move on to some things about strategies. And I'll focus on economic development and social development. Economic development, firstly, I deliberately don't use the word growth. I think we focus too much on growth and on GDP as a measure of growth. I really believe in economic development, but firstly it needs to be sustainable. I don't mean that just in an ecological sense, that's part of sustainability, but I mean it in terms of something which will keep going, not being a flash in the pan. But it also needs to be genuine development, whether it's generating jobs or generating natural resources of one kind or another that are going to be of sustainable, long-lasting value. Not just, for example, financial speculation and things of that kind. And in company with many other countries in the last 30 years or so, really the real economy has been swamped by the finance economy. And you see that incidentally in little ways. If you look at the ABC News, it calls the sector that deals with business. You get your business news on the ABC News from a sector called finance. And you hear about whether some company's developing a new initiative or providing more or less jobs because of its impact on the stock market, not because of its inherent benefits and significance to the broader scene. These things have been reduced to finance. And incidentally, I have a little bit of a theory about that. You'll find there are three sections that news programs always have. Finance, the weather and sport. And my theory is that that's partly because they all depend on numbers, and the numbers change all the time. So it's ideal for the modern 24-hour news cycle. And so we'll hear who won the second round of the Bale Open or something, tennis, which we've got no interest in at all, but it will go there because of some figures and something's happened. And I think that's tended to drive us. Short-term figures have driven our thinking too much, I think, in the last 30 or so years in our public policy thinking. So genuine development, sustainable. I think we need to be careful. I saw someone recently refer to the danger of Australia being a petrodollar economy. The point being that if we live off exhaustible natural resources, rather like oil and Qatar and others who know that they're going to lose all their resources and they're trying to generate some other way of being long-term viable economies and communities. If we rely too much on our natural resources or quarrying them and sending them overseas, and ally that with once-in-a-millennium circumstances in terms of the growth of a country the size of China, we are really building up for ourselves a very difficult future. I think our future is difficult anyway, frankly, but we need to be aware of looking to the longer term. Again, to give you a sort of comparison, as you may know, in the late 19th century, we had about the highest standard of living in the world. To me, relatively speaking, we have to acknowledge that we will gradually move down. And I make the analogy, frankly, with tennis. We were the tennis top dogs when not many other people were playing it. I was thinking, looking at Memorial Drive the other day, going there and seeing all the top tennis players in the world, they're all American, would come and play here. The whole situation's changed. There are more people in the game. Overall, that's a good thing. Same in the economy. There are many more countries in the game. A lot of things that help developing countries will gradually, over time, inevitably move us down the pecking order relatively. If we're global citizens, we need to welcome that, but it does mean that we need to try and think in the long term as to what may keep Australia as a sort of viable and strong environment. We need, I think, to draw more effectively on our national savings. The superannuation schemes have, to a fair extent, moved from the public sector to the private sector, quite a large share of our national savings, and we need to make sure that those savings are still being used to a fair extent for public purposes. Now, there's some technical problems in superannuation funds doing that, but as some of us pointed out at the time when this whole scheme was developed, it's got major problems as the impact it may have on long-term infrastructure investment. And we need to overcome that. We're suffering, I think, from the huge share of our savings which has been compulsorily directed to the superannuation funds. They somehow think they got it through their own merits. Well, they didn't. They'd have scarcely any of it if it wasn't for government intervention in tax concessions and other things. And the governance mechanisms we have for it are not ideal, and the law relating to it is not ideal for us to be able to draw on national savings. So I think that's another important area for us to focus on. And the third area I'll mention, there are many other things, but in economic development I'll mention is that I think one of our major national goals should be to increase the proportion of our population that lives outside Sydney and Melbourne. That's for a whole number of reasons, almost every aspect of life that I could think of. Environmental, social, cultural, work-life balance, family relationships and security, I think would benefit from that. Our cities, the two biggest cities, have gone way beyond the point of economic and social efficiency. And they've done that through distortions. It's not a natural thing. Sometimes people say, oh, you're trying to, force march to the bush. But in fact, a lot of our tax system, a lot of our judgments about what's the best cost-benefit analysis of long-term infrastructure investment, a lot of those are based on biases which favour the large cities and in fact suck people into the cities. I think we need to bear in mind that many people know we're the most urbanised country in the world, except for Singapore and a couple of other island states. But what I think is more of a concern is that we are a freak in the lack of middle-sized cities. The United Nations describes middle-sized cities as 500,000 to 1 million. Many countries, like the United States and others, they may have 20, 30 or 40% of their population living in cities of that size. We've got zero. Now that's a bit of a distortion because there are some cities just below 500,000, some just above. But it still means that we are too, I think, concentrated in a couple of cities, and that's very inefficient socially and economically. Moving on then and concluding with social development, I think it's very important for reasons that I mentioned earlier for us to focus more on education and what I'll call broadly life skills. Much of what we learn at school is either not enormously useful or we learn it 4 times over. In my case, it was probably learning about Henry VIII or something 4 times. But we really need much more, I think, practical emphasis on life skills at school. And this is, again, part of my point about different kinds of intelligence and about educating people to be citizens. And incidentally, even from the point of view of the workforce, there's been a big thrust in the last 30 years of educating people for work. Well, that's okay by me, although work's only part of their life. But the point is that the workforce needs, even 30 years ago, were changing so rapidly and will in the future, that you can't educate in a very specific way for all but a handful of occupations, maybe dentistry or something like that. We need more to educate people to be able to think and to be able to operate effectively in their community. We also, as I mentioned, need to encourage diversity, and I think we need to make sure we don't target our assistance too much. I'm a great believer. My main focus really is on what I'd call, broadly speaking, the 10 or 15% of the community who are worst off. But I've increasingly come to realise what others had realised more quickly, which is that even with that focus, which I, unrelentingly remain committed to, it's not always best to focus all your resources on them, because that may, amongst other things, mean that they'll only continue to the benefit of those resources if they continue to be in the bottom 10%. So that's classic poverty trap stuff. And also that the support that is provided for them may have less political and public support because it's seen as just propping up people. So we do need to make sure we don't over-target. Even for those of us who are so concerned about the worst off, we need to always remember, hang on, even if that's my overwhelming concern, we need to think about helping some people who are a bit further up. We also, and I'll just finish with this as a very practical example, that I think very often, if you look around, you'll find that the sorts of assistance and services that a lot of very disadvantaged people need, quite often it's actually available somewhere, but the people who get access to it are the people who, in the spectrum of eligibility, are the least disadvantaged. they've got the skills or the knowledge to find out about it, to go to it, they've got the confidence to go and to argue their case. And I'm here really drawing on my time at the Welfare Rights Centre, where I saw repeatedly that once they had someone who knew where to go to get the assistance, they would get it in nearly every case. Perhaps things are a little bit worse now, there may be less of a supply of services. But things like plain English communication, and of course in other people's languages as well, but I'm emphasising here plain. To me, that's a real social justice issue. Many people don't get what assistance or opportunities may be available purely because they're not communicated properly and clearly. I quite often see forms of application, which, as you'll know, they'll have a section saying office use only. Many of those forms, in my view, should have office use only over the whole form. They've been designed for the person who's going to get the form, not for the person who's going to fill it in. And I think plain English is a really important social justice goal that in many ways we've got away from. And in the welfare sector there's a danger, I think, of too much sort of academicising. I sort of wonder sometimes about too many academic footnotes in welfare sector submissions. I like more the reliance on, you know, sort of experience we saw in the video.
Very important, Julian.
Oh, sorry, Paul. Yeah, you can put your argument later. But I think those organisations that are purporting to speak on and are deriving their ideas from practical experience should root them in practical experience. Others can put in the more sort of theoretical explanations. Thanks.